everyone for coming. My name is Tim Baxter. I'm the co-chapter president for Young Americans Liberty here at GW. I see a lot of new faces, so I just want to tell you a little bit about YAL and what we do. We're really a two-pronged mission here at YAL. One, we have speaker events, activism, recruitment events on campus. And the main goal is to have those conversations on issues that often aren't being had on college campuses, flushing out that debate, talking about issues, really getting into the policy details. And then second, and this is what makes us different from any other organization on college campuses, is we're involved in campaigns. We're the only organization, right or left, involved on college campuses that's pushing to get young people elected to office. Our goal is to get 250 state reps elected by 2022. For this year, so 2018, our goal was to get 30 elected, and we got 35 elected. So if you're interested in either talking about issues or getting involved in campaigns, learning how to run for office yourself, or interested in helping other young principled people run for office too, YAL is the place for you. Once we're done, I'll be helping people sign up as members, and I'd be more than willing to talk to you about any opportunities we have. We have Liberty Candidate Academies, which are a full day, 12 hours, everything you need to know about how to run and win elected office as a young person. So if you're interested in running for office or being involved with YAL, come talk to me afterwards. Next up, I want to bring up John Jeffrey, who's the head of the John Quincy Adams Society here, and he's going to tell you more about what John Quincy Adams Society does here at GW.
Good evening, everyone. I'm John Jeffrey, the president of the John Quincy Adams Society here at the George Washington University. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the John Quincy Adams Society. We're an organization that works to reform American foreign policy using realism and restraint. The John Quincy Adams Society on campus involves students in career opportunities. We host events, and we bring a lot of really interesting speakers to campus. So if you're interested in learning more about international relations and different theories, and especially the academics behind it, you should definitely join and check it out. We've brought really cool speakers to campus, like the top political analyst, John Holzman, and we work closely with the national organization, which will be actually hosting a special conference call this Friday, where they will have special guest Stephen Waltz. So if you're interested in that, please seek me out afterwards, and I can get you in contact with people you need to be. Next up, I'd like to welcome the moderator for the debate, our very own Emmanuel Sesagan, and YAL Executive Board member.
Thank you for coming to this exciting debate. My name is Emmanuel, and I'm honored to introduce our two distinguished speakers who will be debating whether or not U.S. military intervention is justified to stop terrorism. On the pro side is Fasial Saeed Al Mutar, an Iraqi-born satirist, human rights activist, and writer who admitted into the United States as a refugee in 2013. He is the founder of the Global Secular Humanist Movement and Ideas Beyond Borders, and formerly worked for movements.org to assist dissidents in closed societies worldwide. On the con is Dr. Christopher Preble, the Vice President of Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. He is the author of The Power Problem: How American Military Dominance Makes Us Less Safe, Less Prosperous, and Less Free. And he co-edited with John Mueller, A Dangerous World: Threat, Perception, and U.S. National Security. Preble has also published articles in major publications, including the New York Times, USA Today, the Los Angeles Times, the Financial Times, and many others, and is a frequent guest on television and radio. Before they start, I'll explain how this is structured. Starting with Mr. Mutar, both sides will be given 12 minutes for their opening statements. Then they will each be given 6 minutes for rebuttals. After that, there will be a 10-minute crossfire where the speakers can interact and ask questions to each other. Finally, we'll have 20 minutes for any of you to ask questions to any of the speakers, or even to both of them. Just a quick note on timing. When I tap the desk once, that means the speaker has 30 seconds remaining, and when I tap it twice, it means they have 10 seconds. With that being said, Mr. Mutar, you have 6 minutes for your opening statement.
It's very civilized. Do you want us to sit up here?
Yes.
Hello, everybody. Thank you all for being here. I'm definitely the younger person here on the crowd, so.
Hey, what are you saying?
And thank you all. I mean, I know that Bernie Sanders is speaking today, so thank you all for making the time. I know he's probably much more well known than I am. So I'm gonna start. I mean, there is some complication actually about the title. I mean, me and Yusuf kind of argued a bit about what the title should be, and I mean. I'm not here to defend actually United States foreign policy. I mean, I'm from Iraq, and I know sometimes, not sometimes actually, how sometimes disastrous the arguments are. But I also believe in coalition building. So actually, what I'm arguing for is not necessarily the U.S. intervention, but most rightly is let's say the coalition of the willing in the war against. Most particularly is Islamist extremism that I'm focused on, and I'm working consulting in counter extremism, etc. And I would like to start with one quote that the Middle East is the opposite of Las Vegas. What happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. What makes the ideologies that spring up from that region in particular is that, number one, that area is a very central piece of the world. It's not that far from Europe. It's very close to the Mediterranean River. And every time there is kind of a chaos or destruction in that part of the world, it doesn't really stay there. The Syrian conflict, for example, while many have been advocating for the lack of intervention in Syria, etc., but the result was Syrian refugees dropping into Europe and now creating a huge mass discussion about immigration and what is really the identity of Europe that is now shaping into, or reframed into kind of a polarized society between the far right on one hand that go back to your country style and more of the inclusive left. And that is, in my opinion, is really taking Europe to a much darker destruction. So when we always talk about the Middle East, I mean, we're not really talking about what is better and what is worse. We're always talking about worse and worst. That is unfortunately, the situation of the region. So when, let's define that coalition of the willing. And that coalition of the willing is, in my opinion, the coalition that was built up after the Cold War as a kind of a coalition of the free world against mainly the Soviet Union and also the former enemies of Nazism, etc. So that what's sometimes called the liberal world order. It was established post-World War II and to some extent post the Soviet Union, kind of creating the NATO and a kind of coalition against these other forces. And we have seen that, so if you look at the world not in a black slate movement, sometimes I think what non-interventionists argue is that we kind of exist in this like a black slate moment in which if the United States doesn't intervene, nothing really happens. There is a cost for intervention and a cost for lack of intervention. And if America or the coalition of the willing does not intervene, someone else is going to fill that role. And that role, at least someone else, is either going to be Russia or China at the moment. And if not going to be either one of these two, it's going to be filled with ISIS. So as we have seen in kind of the lack of policy with the President Obama regarding Syria, and he put up the red light that was not really acted upon, and as a result, that was taken as a go-to sign from Russia. And now, and when Russia intervened, and as I said, as a lack of U.S. intervention, Russia was able to fill that role with the support of Assad and stuff. And what we actually got at the end, we got a more destruction of Syria. There was the argument that been used that all the United States wars in Middle East have created more Islamic extremists because if we kill one, we're going to produce them. Well, Russia and Bashar al-Assad, when they kill 100, they also produce 100,000. And the fact that Assad also belongs to a Shia minority supported by Iran and Hezbollah makes the argument that there are actually more Sunni extremists are being generated as a result of Russian intervention than the U.S. intervention. So there is another argument that one of my friends who lives in Congo, who made the argument that, well, it's kind of sad to say, he said, we miss the days of colonialism now after China came back to Africa, in which they pretty much have their own version of economic colonialism that is dominating across lots of parts of the continent. So I'm not here, so I mean, we can definitely argue back and forth about whether the logistics of the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan have really produced the results that were meant to be. And I think I'm more on the side that they actually have not achieved these goals. But let's also not forget that there has been interventions that the United States have intervened in which worked positively, not just in favor of United States national interest, but also in favor of the Muslims as well. So the United States intervention in Bosnia, for example, have protected millions of Muslims have been being slaughtered by Milosevic. And while that is not being argued a lot by a lot of the anti-war types who will be like, no, the United States war in Iraq and Afghanistan are kind of a sort of a war against Muslims. I don't subscribe to this notion. I mean, if the United States were at war against Muslims, it would not have created again a no-fly zone in 1991 in Iraqi Kurdistan to protect Kurds, who are majority Muslim, from the bombs of Saddam Hussein. So while I mean personally, as a leader of an organization and a figure in that kind of the counter-extremism world, I don't really believe that military is the solution to Islamic extremism. In fact, I focus my day-to-day basis on the short-for long-term solutions. We translate books about classical liberalism and human rights and freedom because I don't believe you're gonna bomb your way out of it. I do believe that as someone who comes from Iraq, many of the people, when the United States intervened in that country, have really no idea what words like democracy or individual rights or all of that mean. So as I said, I'm not necessarily advocating for the United States to intervene in every Muslim country and try to bring them to enlightenment. But there's definitely a necessity, in a lot of cases, for the United States to halt or destroy the enemies of the Enlightenment. And that would be, for example, ISIS and Al-Qaeda of Iraq. I mean, what would be the alternative that if the United States, the coalition of the willing, fights them militarily? We're going to give them hugs and flowers? No. We have, I mean, if the leader of Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, and others say that we love life, we love death more than you love life, you are not dealing with a rational actor. One of the main things that I think worked out really well with the United States and let's say the Soviet Union, the communist regime, is that we were faced with a materialistic enemy. So the concept like mutually assured destruction actually works when you're dealing with someone who does not believe in an afterlife and return of the 12th Imam. We're dealing with, in a way, that their navigation of what actually makes up a successful mission. And it's kind of very different than, let's say, how we deal with it in a more the materialistic secular world. So, I mean, in a case, let's say we take like groups like ISIS and say, let's analyze kind of their ideology with one of the bigger manifestos written by Abu Bakr Naji. There's a book called Idarat al-Tawahush, which is translated to the management of savagery. It's considered kind of like the 10 commandments of the groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. And if you look at their kind of situation of what can be defined as losing, there's actually no loss in their definition. If you fight and you get killed, you go to heaven. If you occupy land and you get killed, you go to heaven. If you conquer the land and you stay alive, you also go to heaven. So in their situation, because of kind of, I mean, the move away from materialistic goals, let's say, which is the preservance of life, as the case within the Soviet Union, even though the Soviets didn't necessarily care about the lives of the people, but they cared about the lives of the leaders. While in fact, when you're dealing with somebody like Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, his cost-benefit analysis is definitely much different. So this is, so what I would like to kind of clarify here is that, because I think that this has been not within the anti-war movement, whether it's from the libertarian side on one hand or kind of the left on the other hand, is that they try to frame this kind of the war on terror. And I think they have succeeded pretty well in framing it that it's a war against a different religion or against a foreign entity. And I think that it's definitely not true. And that being said, so we're definitely not at war with Islam. That's in my opinion, that's definitely the case. We're not at war in trying to enlighten Muslims to move them like us. But at the same time, we're definitely at war with some Muslims. The Muslims who want to create a theocracy that will become a threat to other parts of the region, not just other parts of the region. As I said, what stays in the Middle East, what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. So while they might actually, the problem with Islamic extremism is that they don't leave us alone. So that's one of the things that they focus on, because they are motivated, again, by an ideology that is not materialistic, that is focused on a more holy war situation. So we're definitely not at war with Islam. We're definitely at war with some Muslims. And I would like you to imagine some sort of a spectrum between zero of, let's say, the Muslims who are closer to the values of freedom, and then you have tens who are the ISIS of the world and Al Qaeda's of the world, who represent the ultimate destruction and intention to destruct all of these values. I mean, the majority of Muslims are not tens or nines. The majority of Muslims are opposed to extremism, and many of them need the help of other forces. And if you have to choose between Russia and China and the United States, I think the choice is clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Mutar.
Thank you. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. Thanks. A good turnout today. I'll tell you, I went to GW as an undergraduate. The first residence hall was right over there. It was a lot warmer here when I was here as a student. So those of you who are cold, I have a nice warm coat over there. It's an honor to be here with you, Fasial, and we've just met now for the first time. And hearing him speak for the first time, there are clearly some elements that we agree with, and I think as much as we'd like to have a debate, I think it's also important for us to focus on some of those areas of agreement. But let me tell you that from my perspective, when Yusuf first approached me about doing this debate, and I looked at the question, and I've been thinking about this, does Islamic extremism require U.S. military intervention? That's how it was framed initially. That's how it shows up on the website. And I'm meaning this only slightly with my tongue in cheek and saying, well, I interpreted that I was arguing the affirmative. That in fact, of course, Islamic extremism requires U.S. military intervention to mobilize the millions and tens of millions or even hundreds of millions of people, which, as Faisal.
I mean, Faisal. People butcher my name all the time. Yeah, Faisal, yeah.
Which he noted near the end of his remarks.
As long as you don't call me facial, we're good.
I'm not going to Faisal. Of course, U.S. military intervention is used as a pretext to mobilize people to rise up against a foreign occupier, a foreign presence. Now, I want you all to understand very clearly, in addition to being a student here at GW, I served in the George Washington University Naval ROTC, and several of my colleagues were in the Marine Corps. One of them was killed in Iraq. Okay? I take this very, very seriously. Military intervention is not an abstraction for me, right? When I say that American servicemen and women who risk their lives in a foreign country are also inadvertently generating resistance and hostility to the United States, I take that very, very seriously. And yet, for us as a society to ignore that, in fact, the presence of foreign troops, non-Muslim troops in Muslim countries, is in fact a motivation for others to rise up against us, is a fact. We have to admit this. We have to be able to talk about this honestly as a people and not be afraid of being accused of blaming the victim and things like that. So that's one thing I want to state right out of the gate. I think Faisal is also correct to point out that this is a choice between worse or worst, right? As long as none of us leave this discussion tonight and believe that U.S. military intervention is some sort of magic bullet, some sort of magic elixir that allows the good people to prevail over the bad people, that allows the tolerant, liberal, secularists secular people, if that's what we care about, if we want them to prevail, we have to ask ourselves, is U.S. military intervention likely to do that? And that's again where I think we need to move beyond the abstractions. What in particular are we asking U.S. military personnel to do? What role are the various forces going to play? When you drop a bomb from 30,000 feet or 15,000 feet, or if it's a ground launch, if it's a close air support or something like that, you're even closer than that. What do you expect to accomplish by that? I think that libertarians traditionally have been very skeptical of warfare for a lot of different reasons. One of them, and the most important from my perspective, is that war is the health of the state. War allows the state to take powers and do things that it otherwise would not do. And it doesn't relinquish those powers after the wars are over. We've seen this over and over and over again throughout, not just American history, but human history. Right? On the other hand, war is the health of the state. That's why states exist. War provides defense against harm, and that's a legitimate exercise of force. I think most libertarians would agree, most people would agree. But when the United States or any other country wages war in a foreign country on behalf of others, then you do have to ask the question, who benefits actually from this intervention and who is harmed? And if you cannot demonstrate, it seems to me, with quite a high degree of confidence that the right people will benefit, the wrong people will suffer, and the innocents will be protected, unless you can do that, unless you can spell out a mission that provides some reasonable assurance in that, then the bar against military intervention is quite high, appropriately high. Okay? And there are many people you can read about this, and I personally, I've just finished writing a book manuscript, and one of the people that I reread for the first time in a while was John Stuart Mill, right? And he said, if a people don't value their freedom enough to fight for it themselves, then you should have no great confidence that they will be able to retain it once they've seized power. And I think that wisdom still applies, and I think we've seen it demonstrated quite clearly in the interventions undertaken since 9/11, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, and in Syria, where the United States, it's true, did not have large numbers of U.S. military personnel on the ground, but did provide considerable military assistance to people on the ground who we perceived, believed, hoped would be the good guys. So let's not limit this discussion to abstractions. Let's not pretend that military intervention is a magical, wondrous thing. And Fasial, to his credit, did not do that. So let's talk about what works. Another famous libertarian, Leonard Reed, once described libertarianism as anything that's peaceful. Anyone ever heard that expression? Anything that's peaceful. And the reason why is because peace works, actually. Voluntary exchange works. The flourishing of knowledge, the spread of knowledge, the spread of enlightenment works. And we have to have more confidence, it seems to me, in our own ideas, in the attractiveness of those ideas, to believe that they can flourish without the covering fire of American armaments, as I like to say. And I sense that there's not a lot of confidence in this country or around the world in those things right now. And it's dispiriting to me. It's very discouraging. Because of the work of organizations like this, right? Tell me, Faisal, tell me, how often are you escorted to the places you go by the 82nd Airborne? Zero. How often are you delivered to a particular place in a C-130? Zero. How often do the U.S. Marine Corps or the Air Force or any other branch of the services, how often do they drop leaflets or translated texts to the ground? Zero. Do you understand my point? Right? We have to believe that these ideas are powerful in and of themselves. And we have to believe that people are hungry for this information and are not waiting for it to be forced upon them by outsiders. So let me close with this. I've scribbled down a number of notes, which I imagine we'll come back to. And I don't want to take up all of my 12 minutes because I really want this to be more of a discussion. But I don't want anyone to misunderstand that the use of the military tool, as an instrument of power and influence, is never legitimate. That's not the case, obviously not the case. I'm not a pacifist, okay? And there are some people who need to be killed. Osama bin Laden is one of them. I shed no tears when he was killed. I wish he had been killed sooner. I think the reason why he wasn't killed sooner is because we became distracted by the war in Iraq. And we even became distracted by a war in Afghanistan that wasn't even about what the original war was about. But again, let's not lose sight of the great harm that can come from the use of the military. Let's not lose sight of the way in which the use of the military instrument crowds out the other things that are effective and can be effective. And let's not ignore the fact that extremism is, in fact, often caused by resistance to foreign military occupation, to foreign military intervention, and we just can't look past that. We can't pretend that doesn't exist. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Starting with Mr. Mutar.
We definitely have a crush on George Stuart Mill, both of us. So I definitely love this quote. I mean, there is a real world, and there's kind of what we want the world to be. I mean, I think that's the reason why I consider myself an activist and I start organizations, because that we're faced with the different ideals are very different than what we're facing. I mean, in an ideal situation, and I think it would be the greatest solution of all, is really to have the more Muslim countries in the coalition of the willing who would be the ones leading that war against extremism within the communities that they belong to. I mean, I would be happy probably in 2003 if a neighboring country like Jordan, other than benefiting from Saddam Hussein, but rather engaging, considering that they belong in a similar culture or similar faith in that regard. So unfortunately, that call for help from many Iraqis, including the Kurds, was not supported by many of the Arab countries, which creates the room for, again, unfortunately, for a foreign entity to play that role. So I will say that back to the argument is if that foreign entity is to exist, then what would be the values of that foreign entity? And the fact that the two of us are able to have this conversation, and even sometimes are critical of the policies of this country, shows how much better this country is. This discussion cannot happen in Moscow, and cannot happen under the leadership of Xi Jinping. You cannot. I mean, one of the issues that we're facing within my organization is that the fact, like, we wanted to have some events related to free speech or even basic individual rights in China, and they were banned. So, but if we want, so the option one is ideally that the Arab, leading the Arab, because that they have kind of the holy sites and they have the cultural leadership and the religious leadership. If that option is not there, then if we're going to seek a foreign entity, then what would the values be of the foreign entity? And then I think the alternative here is clear. It is the United States, or not necessarily the United States. I think that coalition building in the formation of things like the NATO and others really puts the responsibility on more than just the United States. There are many other issues that exist here that I think worth talking about. But at the same time, so I think that, and also the United States might have much more conflicting interests than countries like Canada when called out to Saudi Arabia to release their prisoners, mainly those who advocate for human rights. And when the Saudis backfired, the Canadians didn't care because they didn't have as much oil interests as the United States does in the region. One of the main reasons that I think that there is kind of a contradiction in a way in the war on terror, in my opinion, is that on one hand, the United States is allied with Saudi Arabia, which is conducting a massive campaign in Yemen that I think is unfair, and also became, for a little longer time, being a sponsor of major extremist groups. And at the other time, so I mean, I'm very straightforward and trying to understand that it's really not the perfect solution. In fact, it is between bad and worse. So if the Saudis and others are not willing to do it, and back, I mean, I think you raised a very good point about whether these policies will help what we come out because they're the good guys, and that would be the liberals. And I mean, I'm a refugee from Iraq, so obviously these policies did not help much. But that being said, one of the main benefits that I think, and sometimes ignored, and we can argue about the Iraq war all the day, is that considering that I mean, under Saddam regime, there were mainly 2 or 3 channels. There was the one for youth, Qanat al-Shabab, Baghdad, Qanat al-Iraqi, which is for, and the first one is really just Saddam meeting in his parliament, and that's all. That's all what you watch on TV. And the other one has like some music, and then they play American Beauty, and they say sometimes that's what Americans look like, etc. So this, in fact, many Iraqis, and I can assure you, many Iraqis don't even that the Gulf War was actually about Kuwait. They think that there were 33 countries led by the Jews, quote unquote, to invade Iraq, and it's called the mother of all battles. That's actually the name of. But look at the situation of Iraq right now. While it obviously had a rise of extremist organizations like ISIS and others that would have been preventable, in my opinion, in some other good policies, such as not the withdrawal from Iraq, which I think was a complete disaster, and allowing the room for Maliki and all of the Iraqi militias to intervene in Iraq, antagonizing more of the Sunnis to join more terrorist groups. But the fact that now Iraq is actually really a free society when it comes to information. I mean, if we're gonna look at the ecosystem that allows the liberals and the seculars to grow, it would have to exist in an ecosystem that allows freedom of expression and freedom of flow of information. The only country right now that actually has that, in my opinion, in the Arab world in general, is actually Iraq. Yes, when a journalist writes an article critical of some militias, he might get whacked. That's definitely a fact. But what is different is that there are the place that allows hundreds of newspapers to be started and published, while some of the authors can be living outside the country, but at the same time having the possibility to influence. And that's what I'm doing. I mean, I'm an Iraqi citizen. I care about this country. I care about the country that I was born in. And even though I'm not inside Iraq, but because of the fact that there is a freedom of information that exists in that country compared to other parts of the Arab world in the Middle East, it allows this country to be actually on more path to let's say the liberal, let's say more good guys are happening. And I think that it's sometimes, and that argument has been kind of used a lot, is that sometimes, I mean, Iraqis have to go the hard way.
My time is up, but try to...
yeah, let's give it 2 minutes. And so one of the things that the Iraqis have to go the hard way is after living under Islamist regime since the Iraq war in 2003 and then 2005, and kind of the rise of ISIS that happened not just recently. ISIS has been in Iraq since 2005. It used to be called AQI, but now just changed names and marketing. So it actually created... Now Iraq, I mean, based on multiple research, is becoming more and more liberal as a society. Some of it as a reaction to the rise of Islamism, but also as because it is the hub for a freedom of flow of information that existed as a result of the Iraq war, with all its bad management, all its criticism, which I think most of it is valid. So I think that will really eventually, if we think of it from a very zoom-out perspective and think about it in 20, 30 years, while there are all these obstacles on the way, I think it will actually lead to the help of the good guys more than the bad guys. Thank you very much.
And now, Mr. Dr. Preble, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you. As before, I want to pick up on a few things that Faisal said. 2 in particular, though, sort of stand out to me. The first is the contradictions of U.S. policy. Now again, on the one hand, the U.S. government is supposed to be responsible for the security and prosperity and well-being of the American people, right? That is its purpose, that is its object. When it strays from that purpose and is behaving mostly to the benefit of others, then at a minimum, you would expect that it not be undermining American security in the process, okay? That's a very, very low bar. And yet, that has not been the case. In fact, the contradictions of U.S. policy are revealed when, on the one hand, the United States, as a policy, professes a commitment to liberalism and democracy and self-determination and good government and transparency and anti-corruption and women's rights, and I could go on, and then allies itself with Saudi Arabia. Full stop. Those kinds of compromises are inevitable when a country, when a government that is supposed to exist chiefly for the benefit of the people who are parties to its social contract strays from that core mission, which it does with some regularity. On the other hand, private organizations and NGOs and think tanks and institutions of higher learning have a other very specific mission. And they draw support and they draw their legitimacy from the fact that they are not in the service of a third party, but in the service of the people who are actually the targets of it. You understand where I'm going with this, right? So the contradictions of U.S. policy, which are so apparent to us, especially over the last few weeks, it's just despicable, just vile, the way that this administration has prostituted itself to this horrific crime against who? Against some terrorist? Against some violent extremist? No. Why? Because he dared to criticize Mohammed bin Salman. That's it. That's all Khashoggi is guilty of. That's it. And he's murdered in cold blood, and the U.S. government's response is, oh, but we care too much about the relationship, or we care too much about the oil. It's despicable. It's disgusting. So, again, I think we agree on this, but I really wanted to pick up on that. Second point. We could talk about the Iraq War all day long. My perspective is very different from Faisal's. My perspective was entirely informed by my career at the Cato Institute. 15 and a half years at the Cato Institute. My second day on the job was Colin Powell's speech to the United Nations making the case for the war with Iraq. My second day on the job. I talked about Iraq for years and years. And trust me when I tell you, I didn't want to talk about Iraq. I didn't want to be talking about it. Because it was a tragedy for this country. But it was a worse tragedy for Iraq. I am encouraged, genuinely, to hear Faisal say that Iraq is in a better place than it was 15 or 16 years ago. But with all due respect, I find that hard to believe. And I think that many Iraqis don't agree with me. Many Iraqis who are still there don't agree with me. I suspect that's the case. Last point. Again, when the U.S. military embarks on a mission in the service of something that is supposed to be tangibly connected to U.S. national security, and it doesn't play out that way, and the American people say, enough, enough, no more, then are we to violate those principles of self-government and say we don't care what the American people say about whether or not the United States mission in Iraq, which in 2011 was 8 years and counting, we don't care what they say? We should stay. That's what Fasial said. It was a disaster to leave Iraq. It was a disaster to leave. So the American people's sentiment on this is irrelevant? What about the Iraqi people's sentiment? Why did the United States leave Iraq in 2011? Because the Iraqi government would not afford the standard protections to American military personnel stationed in that country. It would have been unconscionable for George W. Bush or for Barack Obama to have agreed to leave American troops in Iraq without those protections. And so I disagree with Fasial. It was not a disaster to leave Iraq. It was a disaster to go in. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll be going on to the fun part, the cross
part.
Yeah,
so you can ask each other questions and just interact with each other.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I definitely do not claim to speak on behalf of Iraqis, but if there's one thing I can say for certain, if you ask 3 Iraqis, they give you 5 opinions. I mean, the fact that the country is or was going through a civil war shows that there is a diversity of opinions and how people view not necessarily the foreign enemy, but rather their internal politics. To add to, I mean, we can agree, and might be, I think, in some situations, agree to the point that maybe going in the first place was wrong, but at the same time, the mess was created anyway, and there is an argument to be made. If the United States contributed to create that mess in one way or another, then it should not leave Iraq in a worse situation than it was. As for the argument that it's definitely askable for Maliki and the government there, that's definitely true and arguable. But at the same time, I think al-Maliki at the time needed America more than needed him. So there was a room, I think, for negotiation. While because of Obama's policy he thought it was a bad idea, and even though could be a valid argument that it was a bad idea to go in, it's just we have to be, in my opinion, the United States, when withdraw and allowing al-Maliki, who was the one asked the Americans to leave, to take the salaries of most of the Sunni tribes that were on the front lines of defeating Al-Qaeda. After the surge, with the plan of Jaldaib Petraeus and others who were working with because it's kind of funny to explain, because I was actually involved in reporting on many of this stuff, is that many of these Sunni tribes trusted the Americans more than they trusted the Iraqi government. Because, I mean, in fact, they looked at the Iraqi government as more foreign to them than the Americans were, because they look at them as the Iranians. And as you know, the Arabs and the Persians have a long history of love, including an 8 years war with that country. So many of the people who used to be called the Sahwa movement, which is awakening forces. The awakening forces were on the front lines of actually maintaining that Al-Qaeda or something like Al-Qaeda would not rise again. But after the withdrawal, the Americans saying bye-bye to all of these people, allowing the room for al-Maliki to use that actually as a leverage. I mean, we can actually move forward talking about ISIS. I think there are many beneficiaries of it, including Iran. That being said, I think both of us agree in one way or another that we do believe in some sort of invisible hand. So I'm not here to discuss the intentions of Colin Powell and the Bush administration. I think that some of their intentions might be actually bad intentions. I mean, I don't consider myself a fan of Dick Cheney, and I don't think that he necessarily had the greatest intentions for Iraq. So I'm not necessarily trying to advocate that the people who led that conflict are necessarily moral, had good intentions. But I think what I was talking about is, while it was not necessarily the intention of the United States, I don't think, by the way, the United States should be the leader in that, because of questionable moral situations as we have in Saudi Arabia and others. I believe in more coalition building, including our European allies and those who value human rights and democracy much more than the United States does. I mean, in terms of Trump latest statements, I think that, Trump's brand has always been an asshole, and he actually proved it. He didn't really say anything different in that situation. But and some people say that it's kind of honesty, that he was while like some other presidents were talking about the human rights, and I mean, it kind of sucks when the honesty is really we don't care about human rights. So I consider at this point that the United States might not be actually the moral leader, but it can definitely be a leader in leading that coalition because of its size and because of its leadership. And by intervention, it doesn't necessarily mean that the United States, as it happened in Iraq, which I think was unfortunate, is that the United States leads and becomes the only one. But rather, I think those who, in many countries, I mean, including our allies in North, in Canada and Northern Europe and Scandinavia and others, who I think have put much more value on values that I care about than the United States foreign policy and Colin Powell does. So I think that, I mean, I don't want to stuck in kind of the U.S. intervention. I would rather try to make it further. But yeah, so I think the main argument I'm trying to do is that even if the intention of some of these conflicts, so even if that is the intention, there can be still positive things happening as a result of maybe just self-interest and some businesses trying to advance war and conflict for their own sake. I don't consider myself, I don't have a much of belief in human nature than Professor does. So I definitely do believe that sometimes the need of force is necessary, including in taxation and others. I'm not a taxationist deaf type of guy. So I do believe that there is a need to correct human nature, even though it's I think it's necessary. And yeah, I think just I think
So I'm
there's room
curious.
for questions.
Yeah, so this is a Washington discussion, right? So
Yeah.
this is when you say, don't you think? You finished with a question, right? I don't know that I have a question for you either, Fasial, but I do think that, sort of just picking up on this last point, that good intentions aren't good enough. I actually believe, this might surprise you, I actually believe that George W. Bush and Colin Powell had good intentions. Maybe not Dick Cheney. But Colin Powell, I actually believe that they had good intentions. As libertarians, we should be most skeptical of arguing public policy on the basis of good intention. You must judge the effectiveness of policies on whether or not they deliver the predicted end. And I think that they have not. I think that on balance, they have caused more harm than good. So let me use an example, and I'm sort of curious about this because I've heard this speculated about, and I'm just genuinely curious where you come down on this. So it is true that in a number of predominantly Muslim countries, mostly Arab countries, but of course, the largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia, and the second largest Muslim population in the world is in India. So this is not exclusively an issue in the Arab world. But you are Iraqi, you're Arab, so you understand this perspective. A few years after the war in Iraq, as Iraq was gripped by this horrific civil war, and there were Sunnis killing Shia, and Kurds killing Arabs, and Iranians coming in, and all that, just this horrible maelstrom of violence. A single person in Tunisia made a statement against government oppression and unleashed an uprising of sort of resistance and resentment towards these foreign governments. Do you believe that Mohammad Bouazizi was in any way influenced by the U.S. intervention in Iraq? Or does that reveal this deep-seated human desire for self-determination and liberty that is not contingent on the United States military or the United States government?
Just a quick note, there's 1 minute and 30 seconds left.
Oh, okay. See, I did finish my question.
Yeah. So,
if you're scoring.
Thank you. So, one point I think is extremely important to mention. not all government oppression is equal. The Tunisian government, while it was not influenced by the United States, it was definitely influenced by France and influenced by the culture of France compared to other parts of the Middle East, mainly in Iraq and Syria. I mean, I think that, in fact, I would say that the Iraq war, for bad and worse, showed that despite the fact that Saddam Hussein was viewed as one of the most powerful leaders in the Arab world, was taken down in a few weeks. So I think it definitely played as an inspiration that despite that you can be this marvelous dictator with a mustache, maybe you will be hidden in a cave one day and soldiers from Arkansas will take you away from that. So I think that there's definitely a room for inspiration that many others. And I think that if back to just 1 minute, the all oppression are equal, I think that Iraq without that war would have looked at Syria right now. Is that, I mean, there was, in fact, an Arab Spring situation in Iraq in 1991 called the Intifada al-Ula, in which many of the Iraqi uprising from the south rose against Saddam Hussein, and Saddam Hussein used maybe one of the most barbaric use of force. So it would have been a similar situation as Syria, in which there is I mean, now obviously Assad winning thanks to both Hezbollah and Russia who are helping him. But I think it would have ended in a very stalemate situation in which one part of Iraq, which is sometimes used to be called the Sunni Triangle, that was the area in which Saddam controlled, Baghdad, Tikrit, and Mosul, and then the rest of Iraq would have been Shia, and then this part would have been Iran controlled, and so again, we're always arguing about the worst, and the worst possible situation. So I hope I'm not going to give you so much optimism. I think we're not.
I don't think we're in danger of that.
Yeah.
All right, thank you guys for that great crossfire. I now we'll be moving on to our final statements. And so, Dr. Preble, you have 6 minutes for your closing statement.
Wow, I thought I've said everything.
Yeah, so
I thought we were going to hear from the audience. Were we going to do audience questions?
Audience questions are at the end.
At the
So
end,
immediately
after my
after.
final, okay, my final statement. Look, this was a lot, this was great, and again, it was really an honor to meet you, Fasial, and I'm very, very, supportive of what you're trying to do, and I think you're being successful as a function, and I can tell that based on, the way we judge everything these days by number of Twitter followers. But I do want to come back to what I said at the outset. The U.S. military is an awesome force, just absolutely sort of hard to get our heads around how awesome it is. Awesome in a value-neutral perspective. You understand where I'm coming from here, right? The U.S. military's ability to wage violence at a very high level is unmatched. I'm not even talking about the nuclear weapons part, okay? The United States can project power over great distances, things that China and Russia simply cannot do, still, okay? Russia, by the way, in case you haven't noticed, is struggling with an insurgency in a neighboring state. Now, Donald Trump says we're struggling with an insurgency in a neighboring state. That's something for a different conversation. The United States' ability to project power over great distances is income, simply income. That, however, that fact by itself does not justify the use of force. Anyone at all making the case for military intervention must demonstrate how precisely that use of force is going to deliver the end that they seek. Sometimes the cases will seem quite clear. Fasial mentions the case of Bosnia, which is, I think, a lot more complicated than he let on, but I will allow that Bosnia certainly doesn't look as bad, from my perspective, as Iraq. It doesn't look as bad as Libya. It doesn't look as bad as Syria. It doesn't even look as bad as Afghanistan. All other places where the United States military intervened in various ways and in various stages. So let's not sort of wave away the bad and focus just on the good. It forces us, it should force all of us to ask some really hard questions whenever anyone is making the case for military intervention. and they're very simple. Questions, just questions. What is the interest being served? I think it should be a core United States national security interest. Others would argue about values and whatnot. Let them make that case, but explain what it is you're trying to do. Explain how it is that the military will accomplish this thing, and how long it might take, and how much it might cost. Explain to the American people what they will have to give up in exchange for prosecuting this war. And lastly, explain to us why everything else that possibly could be done has already been tried and failed. Because the use of force should always be a last resort. And I don't think that's a view that's held only by the majority. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think I'm going to make it much shorter than 6 minutes. I think my main point is to make it clear. I don't think we do have the privilege of choice. We don't live in a blank slate. That if the United States does not lead this battle, someone else is going to fill it. And I think that those who will fill it will be much worse in terms of values than America and the coalition of the willing is. What makes Islamic extremism much different than other ideologies we're combating is the fact that it is very much attached to a supernatural and holy war, which makes the concept of mutual assured destruction does not work because of the cost-benefit analysis is much different. On the other hand, the wars that the United States have waged in after 9/11 have been conducted with lots of mistakes and mismanagement. And I completely agree with you in the goal of having a precise goals and kind of, I mean, as a leader of the organization, we have to develop metrics for all the programs we do. So I definitely believe that when the United States invades a country like Iraq, at least they need to know that the Sunnis and the Shias are different. I mean, just FYI, before invading that. So that being said, that there are parts of Iraq, and there are parts of Iraq, and also as a result of these, in my opinion, very complicated wars, have been very prosperous, including Iraqi-Kurdistan. If you go to Erbil, Suleimania, and Hook, you'll see a much better Iraqi-Kurdistan than what used to be pre-1991, and because of the U.S. intervention, because of the U.S. no-fly zone that was initiated. So it's obviously, I mean, we see Iraq and we see the pictures and we see the videos from the outside, but I think that even for those who do care about economics, I mean, the Iraqi average salary is much higher today than it used to be, and for the past 40 years. There are so many metrics that we can also talk about in terms of how the country, while still having a very big bad security issues, still can be discussed that it might be better, even though if you ask for their opinion, Iraqis get type of opinion, so I'm giving mine. And back to kind of the Islamic extremism, which I think kind of the theme of what I was discussing about intervention, is that I think that the war to be won eventually is a war of ideas. It's not, that being said, we are stuck with geopolitical realities and things that happen right now. If we would like to make Afghanistan move towards the path to, let's say, enlightenment or liberalism, and the fact that if we build a higher institution and get bombed by the Taliban, then we're not really achieving. So there is definitely, in my opinion, a need. I mean, sometimes there's this argument, I don't like to use that term, but it's sometimes called bomb and educate, in which on one hand you try to use military force to kind of prevent the enemies of the values of liberalism. And in my opinion, in a much more ideal world, the Muslim world is the one who has to solve its problems. Should not rely on any form of foreign intervention to fix what I think that they should be doing. The Muslim world in general and Arab world in particular doesn't have any lack of resources. They're definitely, Qatar and Saudi Arabia and others are leaders in natural gas and oil. So the argument that the Arabs don't have money is nonsense. I think that what they don't have is a will. And many of them focus in very short-term solutions. In fact, one of the sad moments when I was in the UN and I was meeting with some Saudi representatives, and I said, so I'm like, okay, so when the Houthis showed up in Yemen, immediately the Saudi airstrike started, and I told them in Iraq we have been having ISIS and Al Qaeda for quite a while, and they didn't seem to strike us, these people. And he said, well, I mean, love them or hate them, they still kill the Iranians. That was his argument. So I definitely think that while obviously Iranian expansionism and kind of, I mean, Iran right now, despite all of the sanctions and all of the rhetoric that's being used by the Trump administration and before with the Iran deal, etc., Iran is more powerful than ever. It has, I mean, Baghdad and Sana'a and other parts of Lebanon still have a lot of influence because of Iran. So I'm not trying to kind of downplay the Ayatollah Khomeini revolution, Islamic revolution, that he himself said it starts with Iran but never ends there. So there's definitely, which kind of actually solidifies the problem, is that these movements that exist, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood on the Islamic side, whether it's ISIS on the jihadist side, or the Islamic revolution of Ayatollah Khomeini and now with Khamenei, you will see that these ideologies never stick to their home countries. They never stick. I mean, my organization is called Ideas Beyond Borders, and terrorism and extremist ideologies are also beyond borders. So the difference between us is that we are good ideas worth spreading, and they're bad ideas worth spreading. So the fact that is that these ideas, I mean, to the use of technology, and now we're living in the 21st century, we are seeing that many recruiters who live in Saudi or live in Jordan, live in others, they're recruiting terrorists who live in Belgium and live in France. And so we have to obviously have a global solution to the Islamic extremism problem, and not a U.S. solution, but rather building coalition with other European allies, and also making sure to make the Muslim world solve their own problems. So I'm not here to defend U.S. interventionism, but rather create a framework that I think, that a global framework that we need to combat I think one of the most dangerous ideologies that we're facing in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now it is time for questions. So anyone who wants to ask a question should get in a line right in the middle, near the back. And then we'll just, whoever's first, just go. Try to limit yourself to one question, but of course if the speaker wants to follow up on everything you have to say, that can happen as well.
Oh, nice guy. One question for Christopher Preble, talking about your comments of the killing of the Saudi journalist Khashoggi in the Turkish Saudi consulate in Turkey. Precisely picking up about the comments of Fasial here, worse and worse. We have here a killing, a murder, indeed brutal, of an individual who himself had a nefarious background of anti-Semitic, Israel hater, Islamist, Muslim Brotherhood supporter, and in a region where Turkey itself has imprisoned many journalists, and then we're facing again Iran that has hung many people, killed journalists. So why we of course can condemn this murder of Khashoggi as much as we want, but we still have to deal in this world in the Middle East of again worse, dealing with the choice of evils of trying to. We have to now counter Iran. So what other response would we have in such a universe of such bad options? And
the United States, thank you for your question. The United States of America is extraordinarily safe and secure. We do not need to make moral compromises when our security is not at stake. Our security is not directly threatened by Iran any more than it is by the Saudis, including the 15 who attacked us, the 15 of the 19 hijackers who attacked us on 9/11. It is not obvious to me, in other words, that Saudi Arabia is the greatest ally and Iran is the greatest threat. I think we might be fighting on the wrong side. So the bottom line is this. I don't believe we need to make moral compromises on behalf of either side. I believe the United States should maintain, as much as possible, a neutral posture here. But it's not the killing of a single journalist, which is horrific. And I disagree with your characterization of him as a Muslim. Do you agree with that? Muslim Brotherhood, or Hezbollah, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
That's garbage. I don't think that's true at all. But let's not talk about Khashoggi. Let's not just talk about the killing of one man. Let's talking about why are we not horrified by the war again? Why are we not, as a country, we are now. It took us a long time to get there. Why are we not horrified? Why are we not horrified by the fact that the United States is implicated, directly implicated, in one of the greatest famines of the 21st century, certainly the 21st century, one of the greatest famines going back for 100 years? Why? Because the Saudis are our allies, and the Iranians are our enemies. I'm sorry, I don't approach it that way at all. That's not just how I look at it. I don't think that's true. I think it's accurate.
Yeah, just to add, I think it's really worth talking about Saudi Arabia beyond just the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. I mean, Saudi Arabia has been well known of sponsoring and building madrasas from Pakistan to Bangladesh to India that is generating tens of thousands of that the Americans are fighting right now. I mean, many of the people that Americans are fighting in Afghanistan are the people who went to schools built by Saudi Arabians and Pakistan. So kind of sounds like a bad strategy. On one hand, builds alliance with Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, they graduate the people who are going to kill your soldiers.
Right,
so,
even just focusing on the narrow topic of this discussion, we started out, is Islamic extremism require U.S. interventionism? Yeah, we require interventionism to stop the Saudis from doing it, to stop the Saudis from fueling Islamic extremism. That's where the United States policy should be. And I ask you, are the Iranians more responsible for the rise of global Islamic extremism today than Saudi Arabia? Your answer?
I would say no. Yeah. I mean, the fact that Saudi Arabia, I mean, there's definitely a sectarian difference.
Of course.
Is that the majority of Muslims are Sunnis, and Saudi Arabia, by default, as a Sunni state, have much more influence on the 1.2 billion Muslims, maybe 1 billion Muslims than Iran does, because of the fact that, Iran is just, restricted by the fact they're from different sects. Maybe they have the intention to spread their ideology globally, and that's no doubt, in my opinion, that is what Ayatollah Khomeini wanted to do with the Islamic Revolution. But I think that they are just restrained by the sect, and I think that Saudi Arabia, and not just Saudi Arabia, but Qatar, who has been also sponsoring a lot of Muslim Brotherhood elements, etc. And I don't really subscribe to this idea of enemy of my enemy is my friend. Sometimes the enemy of my enemy is also my enemy. And we don't actually need to pick a side. If there is a side we need to pick, it's the side of the Enlightenment. And if it doesn't exist as a state, maybe we should make it happen. But I don't think we have to be stuck by who is investing more in Twitter and HP and News Corp, but rather really focus on the long term of the people who are our allies in terms of values.
Okay.
Okay. Hey, well, thank you both for coming out.
Thank you.
I was hoping to get two brief questions from each of you about what I'll start with one that I think is most important. So, by the way, Dr. Preble, what year did you graduate from GW?
1989. So now you know how old I was. He said I was old. He said I was old.
Did you go to OCS after that, or?
No, I was ROTC. I was Navy ROTC.
Oh, so for Navy they don't have to go to OCS. They just
No, and I was Navy. So my colleagues were
I was Marine Corps
option.
option.
Yeah,
and so I was a plank-owner over at College Park because we split our doing off.
Oh,
We
yeah,
just
yeah,
have to take the subway downtown and
Yeah,
go
yeah.
here.
Right.
I washed out Camp Barrett though, unfortunately, but it was better as I found out. Faisal, we're talking a lot about this abstract concept of U.S. military intervention. And I think Dr. Preble did at least a good job alluding to the need to really say verbatim what it is that we intend to do. And I think it would be improper for me to ask you, what should the U.S. have done in Iraq? Or what would you propose U.S. do in Syria, especially given how much hindsight we have? But in general, what is it that you envision as this absolutely necessary U.S. military intervention as you perceive it? Do you perceive Marines on MEU going in helicopter at treetop level, swooping down into Tarsus and Damascus? Or what is it? What is the idea that you're selling?
Well, the idea that I'm selling is global coalition, and that's what I started the conversation with. Is that I don't, I didn't say that the United States intervention in the United States should be the one leading. From the beginning, I said that there needs to be a coalition. As I think what terms of future, and if I want to, actually let me talk about the past a little bit. I think what the United States should have done is to install a transitional government in Iraq and build that, because I do believe that democracy is not something you can bomb your way out of it. I think you have to create a transitional government, and they did for a bit with Ayad Allawi, and then they wanted to create elections, quote unquote, even though many of it was sectarian and Sunnis were blowing up election centers, so it was not really fair elections. So I think, talk about the past, I think they should have installed, for the lack of a better word, a transitional government that truly, eventually, the precise goals that I think both of us agree upon, kind of building a Jeffersonian democracy, or maybe a seed of a liberal democracy. I think it's failed because it's difficult when you have a country, and I think Iraq is really surrounded, it's really bad luck. We have Iran on the east, Saudi Arabia on the west, and Jordan and Kuwait. And so the fact that they create a liberal democracy in a region filled with non-liberal democracy sounds like a magic. But I think that it is definitely possible that the United States should have, because of these weird alliances that they still maintain, unfortunately, they could have kept the Saudis and others from stopping, and they should actually talk about concrete policies. I think the United States should, if we're going to impose sanctions on Iran for sponsoring terror, I think you should do the same with Saudi Arabia.
So like after we didn't,
In the name of time, we'll have to move on to the next question, but
after
So I think, if you want to talk about precise, I think that the United States should do. I mean, I totally agree that Iran is the main sponsor of terrorism. They sponsor terrorist groups around the world, and I think Saudi Arabia and Qatar does too. So I think that why not do the same?
Okay, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, oddly enough, two slightly related questions, promised to brief. Both have to do with Germany, though.
Sure.
Yeah. So, in the aftermath of the Second World War, there was a large effort to do soft power in Europe, and you frame this debate very much as if the U.S. doesn't do military intervention, then Russia or China does. And if you win that framing, I agree, of course you win, he's completely wrong. Do you think that you win that framing really when do you think there's a possibility for a soft power intervention that precludes the intervention of Russia and China, like the Marshall Plan in Germany in 1946? And then related to that, way back earlier in German history in the 1520s, if you thought, for example, the Ottoman Turks might have looked at the absolute hellhole that was Europe in the 1520s and said, these people are having some very intense ideological battles, I think we should get involved here and sort some of this out. And of course, we have no other interests in the Balkans, but to sort out the terrible problems that Europe is having right now with all of this new technology spreading out new ideas. Do you think that there's a way to say that the advancement of this technology is, in real time it looks very violent, but that it's actually sort of the process of the Enlightenment happening on its own in the Middle East as it did in Europe, dragging and kicking and screaming, and to intervene there is less necessary when you can let that ideological conflict play out and support liberal groups with soft power?
Very wonderful question, by the way. I love your framing. I definitely put a major priority on soft power over power. I mean, sometimes the United States is in positions in which they are doomed if you do, doomed if you don't. And sometimes if you intervene when there is 20,000 civil wars happening in that country, as in the case with Syria, I was advocate for intervention in Syria before all of that mess that was created, I think, as a lack of intervention. So I think there is a cause for both. There is a cause for military intervention, there is a cause for non-military intervention. That being said, I think there definitely should be a priority on soft power solution because, I mean, that change is going to come slow. And it has to be coming from the people to really adhere to it. That being said, understanding the culture, understanding the dynamics of that region in particular, it is a collectivist in nature. While it might appeal to some form of a freedom market and not an anti-Marxist ideology, but the same thing is appealing in nature. And sometimes you don't really have to change winning the hearts and minds of everybody. What you need to change is the mind of the tribal leader. And sometimes you bribe that guy. And I have worked in similar situations, I've talked to people who have worked in similar situations, is that really you don't really go to every Muhammad and every Ali and tell him like, oh, you should read Steven Pinker and these are the 4 cases for reason in science and humanism. But I can definitely tell you that if you tell this tribal leader from Shimari and all of their tribes that work in West Baghdad and West Iraq, and you tell them that, okay, here is $1,000 and don't blow up the school, or try to give us some security, and it's definitely doable. So I think that there is a room for both, in my view.
I don't have much to add. I love that framing. I will say, just as a quick note, as much as I understand why people want to point to the experience in Germany and also in Japan after World War II as being shining examples of successful nation building, that's a deeply misleading frame, because neither of those countries needed to be built. They were already built. They already existed. Most of what we talk about in nation building today is in building nations that don't exist. And that's much harder.
Thank you.
I just wanted to bring up Fasil's point because he's mentioned it several times during the debate, which is the power vacuum that is created.
Oh yeah, no, you're right. I need to address this. Let me be very clear. If I believe that the only alternative to a US-led global order, such as it is, was a Chinese-led one or a Russian-led one, then I wouldn't support it. I am an American after all, and I'm also a liberal, and Russia is not a liberal country, and China is not a liberal country, but I do not believe that is the only alternative to the United States performing the role that it has since World War II. The reason why I believe that is because Russia is a declining power and overly dependent upon resource extraction. China is a rising power, but its ideological influence is significantly diminished and is constrained. And there are dozens of other countries that could be empowered to do more, but are discouraged from doing more precisely because they're dependent upon US power in the first place.
What makes you say that China's ideological?
Yeah, I don't see their ideological appeal in the same way that Western ideas have spread. And you see that a little bit in the reaction to Chinese colonialism, we have to call it what it is, in Africa. The resistance to their interference in some of these countries. So, again, if I believed that China was actually going to replace the United States as the dominant power globally, then I wouldn't support it, but I don't believe that's true. I don't believe they can.
Okay, but China might not be...
In the name of time, we're going to have to move to the next question. I'm sorry.
I didn't know that.
I'm glad you brought that up. I meant to address that question because it's one that Fasial brought up a couple times, and I should have addressed it. Thank you for the question.
May I ask a question? Like, what do you think? Why do you think Russia is declining? I mean,
Because Russia's declining.
because they just like had an attack on Ukraine.
Yes, and they are able to carry out attacks in their neighborhood against a weak and corrupt and divided government like exists in Ukraine, but that does not mean they are able to wage a protracted, long-scale war in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, like the United States has done for 16 years with no discernible impact on U.S. national security or U.S. economic output. Russia is a declining power. They are literally dying. Literally dying. Their life expectancy is declining. They are dependent upon resource extraction, which is inevitably a very, very vulnerable way to sustain your economy. So I do get very frustrated by the lumping together of Russia and China as though they are in any way comparable. They're not.
I'm not saying this. I mean, let's assume that's part of it. Don't you think that Russia is also influencing elections? I mean, they have the power of...
Yes, I actually do believe that Russia influenced elections, unlike some people in this country. I actually
so they manage to exert power differently than sending arms.
I will say, no, it's a good point. I will say that Vladimir Putin is playing a weak hand relatively well, although I don't believe that he has achieved some geostrategic masterstroke by having Russia be drawn into the Syrian civil war. I think, in fact, that if you were to ask Vladimir Putin in a candid moment, how does he think it went for Russia to intervene in the Syrian civil war, I think he would tell you candidly, I wish we hadn't done it, because it hasn't been good for him and his country.
Thank you so much for coming today. This has been somewhat of a pessimistic discussion, so I wanted to turn that around a little bit. I was wondering what reasons we may have, if any, to feel optimistic about the future of the Muslim world with regard to secularism and or liberalism. I know that can be hard to predict, but in the long game, 30, 40 years from now, with maybe polling data or other reasons.
Well, I mean, actually, there is lots of data to support, not as precise and clear as I want them to be. But as I mentioned, that kind of let's say the invisible hand situation in the war in Iraq, and the role of the Islamists as we had in Iraq and Egypt and all of that, there is definitely a huge reaction, mainly within the youth, that is very seeking and curious about the alternative to theocracy, and alternative to a more call for individual rights and more call for really what it means to actually have a property that's not going to be confiscated by the government. And we see that from our end. We see the numbers of views and downloads, and I mean, these are metrics, obviously not the best metrics, but they definitely view trends. There are books related to the subject we're talking about that have been downloaded millions of times from Saudi Arabia, etc. I mean, the way we do things is we acquire the books in English, we translate them to Arabic, and they're available for free as a PDF. And then we allow people to download, upload them on servers, etc. And we have, I'm constantly motivated optimism every day of how much there is a lot of engagement in that content. So there's definitely optimism. I think it's definitely going to come from a newer generation that is disappointed with the current situation, and I think they want to turn to that direction.
Yeah, I give a shout out to one of our sister organizations, the Atlas Foundation, which is again a sister organization to the Cato Institute. I also give a shout out to my colleague Mustafa Akyol, who's a Turkish scholar, has written eloquently one of his books, Islam Without Extremes, which I like very much. And now he's currently working on a book project which addresses precisely this question. You know Mustafa?
Yeah, we did a panel together.
Yeah. I figured you would have. Yeah.
And otherwise, people hold the stereotype that all brown people know each other, but we don't do know each other.
Hi. So I came in pretty torn about this thing. I didn't know if it was for or against, and you guys kept pulling me back and forth. So I actually was born in Somalia, which is a very devastating result of the failed, we tried to intervene and we failed miserably. And at the same time, I do question that, would it have been better if there was an intervention? I am not sure. So my question is, are we placing a lot of value on immediate change? Like, let's help these countries have democracy. And then when these countries actually become democratic, which means technically the majority rule, and it's not always great, the majority could be terrible.
Right.
For example, we have Hamas, we have the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. Do we have the right to then object to these democracies? Because they were. They were fair elections. Right. And in addition to that, so because we shouldn't be placing so much value on immediate results, isn't it better to have transitional governments or to help either the democratically elected governments that we don't agree with and kind of use soft power to challenge the ideas of the populace so they can elect in the future, since the system is there, they would elect somebody a bit more secular, more aligned with their ideas. And I'm sorry, I'm a terrible public speaker.
No, you've asked a question, you've asked a good question.
Yeah, so what makes democracy necessarily better than, say, the system in Singapore, which is terrible? I'm not saying it's good. Right. For example, a benevolent autocracy kind of. What do you guys think? Isn't it better to have that kind of system if we're talking about worse and worse, rather than having the general population vote and then elected democracy we don't agree with, then we intervene? What do you guys think?
So let me answer it quickly. I am not a subscriber to the view that of a democratic peace. I think it's much more complicated than that. On one hand, you could argue on consequentialist grounds. You could argue on sort of just pragmatic grounds that democracy is better and therefore we should be promoting democracy, but I think that's not true. I think the evidence does not support that. I think we have to differentiate, as you alluded to, between democracy, which is one man, one vote, and 50% plus one, versus liberal democracy, which affords critical protections to religious and ethnic minorities and even just the voting minority. So those are critical distinctions. Last point is this. I also, as a libertarian, and as a person who believes that the foundational principle of good governance is the individual and individual rights. And one of those critical elements is self-determination. And so anything that interferes with my right to choose who governs me is an offense, is an imposition, and is contrary to my values. And therefore, while I am sympathetic on practical grounds to the argument for a transitional government that was imposed on Iraq by the United States, I reject that. I reject that. That's not appropriate. It's not right. It's not the right thing to do. And ultimately, it's not right morally, philosophically. It's also not good over the long term, because mostly what you'll do is engender resentment and anger at you, the United States, for having imposed on people a government that they didn't elect in the first place. We saw that in Iran in 1953. We saw that as recently as in Egypt in 2011. So it's a Faustian bargain. It's a bad deal for the United States.
Yeah, there is sometimes I do struggle with this personally. Is how to not engage in cultural relativism of racism or political expectations. I have grown up in the Middle East, I kind of struggle, like when you go to areas, for example, like Ramadi and Fallujah and kind of the desert Anbar province, and you look at how many people in the Bedouins live and people that are outside the cities, and you think that you think of Jeffersonian democracy or liberal democracy. It's not the first thing that comes to your mind when you are in these situations. When you're walking in Peshawar or where Malala Yousafzai was shot, and many of these areas, and I think Afghanistan kind of a similar case in some areas compared to others, is that liberal democracy is not what first comes to mind. Number one, while I do believe that things can change. Europe did not have a democracy before, and they moved towards, because of the rise of Enlightenment, and then they took that direction. I don't think that necessarily the direction the Muslim world will take. I mean, we have this model, which is the European model, in which through the French Revolution and others, the rise of the Enlightenment, it led to that. I don't necessarily think that it has to be the case in every other country. And knowing that in some parts of let's say, let's take Iraq or some parts of the Gulf as an example. I mean, many of these societies have lived for hundreds if not thousands of years under this concepts of tribe and a leader of tribe. And these concepts that we were talking about, like individual rights, and well, I'm a big fan of individual rights and stuff. I won't say that they will not get it, because I think over a period of time and maybe with some form of education, now with the rise of technology and the internet, we can definitely influence people to go towards that direction. But I think it will be much harder in some areas compared to others. So I don't necessarily believe, so if that is not the case, then what is the alternative? If democracy is not the case, then what is the alternative? Then it's always going to be a hit and miss situation. I mean, in the case of Singapore, while it's kind of viewed as mixed bag, because it's Lee Kuan Yew who is the founder of Singapore, and now his son is yes, they are anti-corruption and all of that. I think so. The values they hold are good, but how likely are you going to get a dictator like this? I mean, if you look at the Middle East, in which you have Hosni Mubarak, in which most of his Egyptian resources are centered within one person, Saddam Hussein, Assad, all of these names, I can mention 100. It's not likely that you're going to have someone like Lee Kuan Yew who will focus, who will make the country move from the third world to the first world. It's just, maybe, Singapore, it might be just like a likely situation that the dictator happened somehow to have. I think he went to Oxford and studied philosophy or something like that. Like he actually had a mindset and a vision. Compare that to like Saddam Hussein, who barely finished middle school. I think there is
Oman.
Yeah, I mean, Oman is another, which is, but also like Oman has a very different sect of Islam compared to others, right? Which are the Khawarijites who are...
It's becoming very Sunni now.
Yes, thanks to the neighbors.
Saudi.
As for the second argument, that you mentioned about the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, there is this, for those of you who know Brookings Institute, they have a Doha Center, which is funded by Qatar. And one of the main authors of the Brookings Institute, his name is Shari Hamid, and he wrote 2 books. One of them is called Islamic Case for Islamic, something related to that Islam is different than other religions. And his argument was, you know what, it is their culture. The people that elected the Muslim Brotherhood, democracy is much more important than all of that. And in fact, I would argue that the United States policy, United States during the Obama administration, to some extent was not antagonistic to the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, in Egypt and some other parts, they met with the Muslim Brotherhood and accept the results as they are and kind of show that, see, we respect your choice. But that not necessarily mean on the long term, this government would be allied with the United States or any of that.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank both of our amazing speakers here today. And with the amazing job.
I love it. Thank you all.
Now, as many more events like this, I think about a month ago we had a debate with 2 different speakers about immigration. So issues like these, I think we're very passionate about. I really do think you should join now. At the very least, if you sign up for our email list, you can get a lot more information about events just like this. I'd like to thank all of you for coming and bid you a good night.